Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on early Native and African American histories. In chapter 4 of Takaki's book, the author talks about how Andrew Jackson felt about indigenous people and led brutal battles against them, believing that they should be exterminated and their lands opened for white settlement. He believed in advancing civilization and progress and upheld states' rights to ignore treaties with tribes. He also refused to enforce Supreme Court rules that banned states from encroaching into Indian lands. As President Jackson began promoting moving indigenous people to the western side of the Mississippi, he presented himself as a paternal figure and that his aim to remove them was his way of protecting them. However, if his Indian quote unquote children refused to be removed, he warned they would have to live with the consequences, insinuating the consequences would be severe. One example of the consequences of this kind of removal was the experience of the Choctaw Nation. In 1805, the Choctaw Treaty created tracts of land reserved for Choctaws, encouraged them to create small plots of land per family and become farmers. Abiding by the treaty, however, did not protect them from eventual removal. So even though they abided by this treaty, believing that if they followed these rules and expectations, they would be safe, this was not the case. As the next treaty they were coerced to sign, agreeing to their removal west of the Mississippi River. Resistance would lead to removal by military force. Eventually, they lost over 10 million acres of their land. The more known of these kinds of removals was the Cherokee Trail of Tears, where we see similar strategies used in the state of Georgia to ensure the removal of the Cherokee Nation. In 1829, the state of Georgia extends its state authority over the Cherokee Nation territory, giving them the choices to either leave the state or be subjugated to white rule. In 1835, a small pro-removal group from the Cherokees agreed to sign a treaty, but they were not representative of the majority of the Cherokee Nation. When they had to ratify the treaty by the entire Cherokee Nation, there were a number of strategies used to suppress the vote of those who were against removal by those of the Cherokee Council, including jailing, putting some of these folks in jail, suppressing the Cherokee newspaper in order to minimize the number of anti-removal votes and ensuring the ratification of the treaty. They were eventually forcibly removed by the military force because the majority of the Cherokee people did not want to be removed. And hundreds died as a result of the conditions during the hundreds of miles of walking they had to do from where they were, from where their original lands were, to where they were moved to in Oklahoma. And this map really gives you a sense of that trail. And you can see here from this side of the country, from Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, and so on, moving from this side of the country, walking all the way across all of these different states to get to this side. That's the extent of the walking through winter, old, young, children, and so on. So this gives you a sense of that distance and what it actually meant for them to be removed from their land to what was now reconstructed as their new land. As the country continued to progress economically with the building of the railroads, for example, more and more tribal lands had to be appropriated in order to make room for the railroad. In 1871, the Indian Appropriation Act declared that the US would no longer acknowledge tribal nations or go into treaties with them. And this allowed for them to be able to just take over land without necessarily needing Indian tribe approval or agreement. The railroads resulted in killing of wildlife that was indigenous people relied on, for example, the buffalo. This encroachment of lands also created hostilities between different indigenous tribes, like the Sioux and the Pawnee tribes, as the Sioux were also pushed out of their lands and into Pawnee territory. Eventually, for protection, the Pawnee tribe decided to settle in reservations in Kansas. The reading also talks about this particular painting and how it depicted this American progress. This painting was created by John Gast in 1873, and it depicts this progress moving from the east to the west. And you see the impact of this progress on indigenous populations. You can see on the right side of the of the painting, you see the woman holding electrical wires, the movement of the telegraph, you see the train in the background, and so on, moving westward. And on the western part of, or the left part of the painting, you see the indigenous people and the edge moving away. You see the buffalo also moving away. So it's a representation of sort of this Western, this progress moving west, but also what it meant in terms of who got to take over the land and who got to disappear. You also see here American progress represented as a white woman dressed in white, so sort of indications or insinuations of purity, virginity, and so on. The next chapter talks about this time period in relation to African Americans and their experience in the North. By 1860, 225,000 African Americans lived freely in the North. However, this does not mean that they didn't experience racism. And what this chapter demonstrates is the different kinds of experiences and difficulties they had living in the North. We see, for instance, they lived under segregated conditions. They were disenfranchised from voting. Whites still held stereotypical beliefs about them as naturally lazy, childlike, unfit for work, which alleged to them being discriminated and within the labor force. The media images of Black as criminals led certain states to restrict their migration, like the states of Ohio and Indiana, which required Black migrants to post a bond of $500 to ensure against them becoming a public charge and as a pledge of good behavior. So you can imagine if you are African American and trying to move to these northern states and you did not have this money, then you were not allowed to move into these states. We also see how a lot of the arguments against Black migration to the North relied on fears around intermarriage between Black and white people. And so a lot of the narrative around forbidding Black migration was around protecting white women. The reading also talked about the image of the Sambo and why it was upheld by white slave owners. They believed that if they could convince their critics that their slaves were actually happy and satisfied with their condition, that the criticism against slavery would cease. And so the Sambo image of slaves was of them being childlike, irresponsible, lazy, yet at the same time affectionate and happy. The reading also talked about African Americans who seemed to fit into this Sambo image, but were actually in many respects performing this image in strategic ways as a way to either improve their conditions or just survive within their conditions. The reading also talked about how, quote unquote, playing the Sambo was used as a way to deceive their masters, while behind the scenes they were planning rebellions. Slaves also used subtle forms of resistance, like using work slowdowns or taking animals from their masters for their own use. They also feigned illness in order to avoid labor. So you really have to think about, the people that seemed to fit into this idea of the Sambo, that they were the happy-go-lucky slave. How real was that, and how much that was a performance in order to deceive their masters or strategically be able to make their conditions better. The reading talked about some of the key African-American figures of this time period, many of them who escaped slavery to the North and then became part of the abolitionist movement. One such figure was Frederick Douglass, who was the son of a slave woman and her white master. And so this also speaks to how he and others like him represented that fear that people initially were expressing around intermarriage. He was taught to read by his master's wife, who, because she had not owned slaves previously, did not realize that this was something she was not allowed to do. When the master realized that not only learning how to read, but being in the North and being in an urban space was making him, quote unquote, restless, the master decides to send him to a slave breaker where he could properly be broken into a slave. He eventually escapes slavery, enjoys the abolitionist movement. And one of the things that the reading point out about the fact that he was very much aware of his background as being both Black and white was that his first wife was Black and his second wife was white. And again, how aware and outspoken he was about the fact that he knew he was both white and Black. In contrast, another figure is Martin Delany, who was the father of Black nationalism. Although he was admitted to Harvard Medical School in 1850, resistance by fellow white students results in him not being allowed to attend. And this, along with various racial hostilities he experienced in the North, led him to his immigration to Africa movement. Early on, he was in favor of that the only way that Black people could gain freedom or liberation or be experience a life of full humanity is if they went back to Africa, that would not be possible for them in the United States. Yet at the same time, he believed economic contributions of African Americans made them worthy of American citizenship. As he would state, we love our country dearly love her, but she doesn't love us. She despises us. Eventually, once we get to the Civil War, he decides to join the Union Army and ends up having a successful career, a military career. So it's interesting, he's an interesting figure to see how his politics shifted over time, but also how the racism that he experienced shaped his politics and how he thought about the place of African Americans within the United States. After the Civil War, Blacks are freed from slavery, but they are not given land because it was believed they had to be, quote unquote, taught hard work, patience, and frugality, which is ironic when you think about it, that they were denied access to land for these reasons, while at the same time, white settlers were taking land from Native Americans. They became wage earners and sharecroppers, often indebted to their former masters. So when they couldn't find work elsewhere, they ended up working in the same plantations where they had been slaves. This time they were getting paid, but at the same time, because they were living on land that belonged to the plantation owner, they were often in debt. So whatever they owed ended up equaling or surpassing the wages they earned. As industrialization increased, African-American laborers made up a large number of industrial laborers. So you see, particularly in the South, this sort of shift from sharecropping and working agricultural work to working in industries as those began to arise, but that they became once again significant to a particular labor force, right? So that the South still required or relied on the work of African Americans. Another figure of this time period, particularly after the time period of Reconstruction in the 1890s, as the rise of Jim Crow segregationist laws and lynchings increased, African Americans had to be more cautious about demanding rights, and had to become part of what became known as the accommodationist African American leadership, where they accommodated some of the segregationist ideas of the mainstream white population, while at the same time trying to figure out ways to continue the progress and betterment of African Americans. So Booker T. Washington believed that African Americans should focus on their economic progress instead of on social integration with whites. He was in favor of African Americans gaining technical skills they could use in the labor force, and in favor of creating their own Black institutions. So his focus was really on improving the Black community, and not so much on integrating the Black community with the white mainstream. However, the reading did talk about how behind the scenes, he did fund and support integrationist and laws, and was in favor of fighting against discrimination and so on. So you have to sort of think about, right, what is the public, right, presentation of themselves as African-American leaders at this time, and versus what are they doing behind the scenes, right? Somewhat similar to when we were talking about the Sambo image, right? Portraying something that was acceptable to the mainstream in public, right? While behind the scenes doing something different that was much more about improving their conditions and fighting the racism and discrimination of that mainstream world. So this ends our lecture for this week. I will see you guys next time.